Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm going to be doing my 14.17 top lane tier list. So if you enjoy the content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a couple of changes this patch, mostly focused around the system changes. Obviously, Fleet got nerfed, Absorb Life got nerfed, Cut Down got nerfed, and then Warmogs got nerfed as like a direct response to a lot of supports rushing it. That did hit Mundo. On top of this, we saw buffs towards Varus, Rise, and Twisted Fate. We also saw nerfs towards Silas, Aurora, Kennen, and Rumble. And then on top of that, there have been some other shift around. So let's cover the tier list. To begin with, the D tier is going to stay relatively similar. Nidalee, still a very niche top lane pick, has kind of gone back down in popularity. Kind of rose up through her AD ratios as being a pretty lane dominant pick where you utilize Grasp and her Cougar form to get those stacks and then translate that lead early on into something later. But this champion is still very high in mechanic demand. She also very much requires to be very advantageous in the early game to really translate into any lead. That's just stuff I wouldn't really recommend playing in mid elo. Plus, I believe the champion to be quite weak at the moment, especially if you are going like the AD route. So Nidalee going to be within my D tier. Shyvana, too exploitable in her first couple of levels. Of course, if you're able to consistently land E and then look for those angles, you can actively trade back against opponents, but against a lot of champions, you'll just really struggle to ever find those angles. Her reliance on ultimate means she has cleared downtime windows. Overall, it's just not a pick I'd really recommend in the top lane at the moment. Lucian gains his popularity primarily because of his pick rate in mid lane. However, they did end up nerfing that down, combined with some of his itemization. Both the Kraken and the Bork got nerfed, and thus he has definitely lost a lot of power in the solo lane. They did buff up his passive, but that only really helps him in the bot lane, so he stayed fairly neutral there. But Lucian definitely not performing well as a top laner at the moment, especially in mid elo. Gangplank, very high demand champion. If you're not an OTP, this champion can be quite hard to pilot. If you're not getting good barrel value, then you lose a lot of this champion's strength. Obviously, you can play him fairly aggressive early on into the game, utilizing your Q harass to really chunk people out, but that is really where his power lies if you cannot consistently land barrel combos. Overall, I'd recommend avoiding this champion unless you're willing to sink a lot of time into this pick. He'll mostly stay within my C and D tier for average elos unless he is very oppressive in a certain patch. Cassante also was very pro-dominant, still to a degree is. He is balanced primarily around elite and pro. He is going to be weak for the average player. Obviously, when you have both accessibility to tank and skirmisher kits, it does provide so much value for your team comp. Overall, I'm just going to recommend him if you play him, if you put a lot of time into him, then he can be viable. If you're not, then just stay off Cassante. Not something I'd really recommend playing, especially within the mid elos. Akali got punished primarily because of her mid strength. She lost a lot of power in her E and ultimate. Overall, it's left her relatively weak in the top lane. She also doesn't have any great AP bruiser builds. You tend to just see the same build in mid lane convert into top lane. This is the Electrocute, Lichbane, Shadow Flame core, and then you can kind of just go standard AP core. What would be like your Rabadon, your Zhonya's, your Void stuff like that. Overall, yeah, the champion's underperforming in the top lane now. Skarner. So Skarner is... Actually, no, I'm going to move Skarner up into the C tier, but I'll talk about him in a second. We have a couple of champs which I'm going to leave or like bring down here are Vayne. So Vayne is definitely underperforming with all the system nerfs. The Bork changes really hurt her. Fleet being nerfed really hurt her. She got nerfed back along. She lost like 50 movement speed on the passive combined with some QCD. It really incentivizing that Q max build, which we primarily see these days over the W max, as that was considered quite frustrating to play against. Overall, Vayne really struggling now. You can still play her as like a counter pick into matchups where they don't really have the tools to ever catch you or play against your mobility. She can definitely function in those, but you're a lot more vulnerable than you have been in the past. Continuous nerfs to systems which utilize Ghost as another example have definitely left her in a pretty rough spot. I've seen some like other rune variations like some Summonary Veins and some PTAs, but they don't seem to find the same level of success, and yeah, she's definitely in a pretty rough spot. Other champions which I'm bringing down are Smolder and Varus. So in Varus's case, he gained in the bot lane quite aggressively this patch. His lethality builds are doing very well, and I expect them to get nerfed in the next patch. But the builds which he has in the top lane, the Nashers, the Lockets, the Borks, the Kraken Stairs, all these have either been nerfed like directly in the item system, or have been indirectly nerfed through the champion being hit. This would be like losing some flat W damage, hurting the Locket build, as he's very reliant on his base damages, and like the AP ratios going down on his W, also hurt like the Nasher variants. Overall, it's left top Varus in a pretty rough spot at the moment. Obviously, he's still considered pretty strong in Elite, where spacing and utilizing the full kit of this champion can definitely feel quite oppressive for a lot of champions, especially with the maximum health damage on the W. But it's definitely not something I'd really recommend for average elos. Same goes for Smolder to a degree. He's had, well, Fleet being nerfed hurt him quite aggressively. He does have choices in Grasp, and I've seen some Shojin Rush variants. Obviously, you still have your Trinity, your Manamunes, your Cosmic Drives. There's variants there which can all function on this champion, but he's definitely underperforming now, so he drops down to the D tier. The other two champions which remain here are Jace and Twisted Fate. In Jace's case, he's been underperforming for a while. He was kind of using Fleet as a crutch rune, but the nerfs to that have definitely hurt him, combined with obviously D-Blade being nerfed in the previous patch. He's primarily just paying for the sins of running items which marksmen run. He also took a bit of a hit with some of the lethality items being nerfed for ranged champions. That hurts him in his ranged form. And overall, he's not doing too well for average elos. He still is primarily a high-skilled champion, so he does do a bit better in the elite levels. And then he does do a bit better in mid lane on top of that. So if you want to play Jace, I'd recommend him in mid lane, running something like a lethality electrocute setup, but in the top lane, yeah, definitely underperforming at the moment. But he does have rune choices which can definitely ease up some of his matchups, whether it's like Phase Rush or Conqueror. Twisted Fate, obviously, definitely got Riot specialed. He was very strong, and then they nerfed him quite aggressively multiple times, and then all the systems which he really uses got nerfed, and overall Twisted Fate's basically dead in the top lane now. You don't really see him being played. He was obviously towards the end of his life cycle being primarily played in high elo and competitive, but he's basically faded out of competitive completely now, so he remains within my D tier. Skarner, going to be moved up to the C tier. He is very unpopular in the top lane. He just hasn't really found any traction, and even though he's doing a bit better now with the 2 sets of buffs he received, they weren't really enough to bring his popularity back. It wouldn't surprise me if they do a slight kit reshape to try and encourage people to play him in the top lane again, as I know a lot of people who would if the champion was slightly better or not as frustrating and had like different options in build choices. But Skarner, gonna sit towards the middle of my C tier. He's actually a pretty high skill champion though, so if you sink a lot of time into him, you can definitely be rewarded. Riven, a very high skill champion, very feast or famine. If you get early kills, you can definitely stable on this champion, but it can be quite hard finding those early advantages, especially if you don't put a lot of time into this pick. She's very reliant on her auto cancels, utilizing like windows where you can do increased amounts of damage can be the difference between being really fed on Riven and being basically useless. So yeah, this champion, something I'd recommend avoiding unless, once again, you are willing to sink a lot of time into this pick. Rumble nerfs were placebo for the most part. I'm surprised they even nerfed him. In fact, these changes were actually mostly nerfs towards jungle Rumble, which is unfortunate, as I think it is a nice niche spot which he can be played in. It's kind of faded out at this point with 2 sets of nerfs towards Rumble. Obviously, the previous ones were the Q nerfs. Overall, in the top lane, he's definitely underperforming for the average player, but these changes don't move him from where he was. They're just a slight bit of damage down, but yeah, very placebo. Yasuo definitely going to be struggling a bit more with the fleet nerfs. Same goes for Yone. Yone sits towards the higher end of the C tier. Yasuo sits towards the lower end of the C tier. He tends to be a bit less performant than Yone. Yone scales a bit better. Yasuo tends to be a bit more early game skewed, tending to tread a bit more elite, but both of them are just elite skewed in general. They're high skill, squishy skirmishers, so that makes sense, obviously. But the changes to Bork and Zerkers have hurt their Q thresholds. You're now having to get like level 10 with Alacrity to really get full value out of that, full value out of your Q, getting it down to that 1.33 CD. Overall, yeah, these champions definitely doing a bit worse now. Rengar, very niche pick. He's basically kind of just completely faded out of the top lane, aside from like a couple of OTPs, so it's quite hard to really rate him. I think he's a bit easier to play in the top lane than in the jungle, which is why I have jungle Rengar D tier. top lane Rengar C tier. You have different rune choices, but obviously Fleet being nerfed does hurt that choice. So Grasp and Electrocute are your other two options. Conqueror can also be something you opt into, but he's doing pretty poorly these days. I think Rengar could either do a reshape, which benefits Rengar mains and allows for other people to try Rengar without being completely demolished for like their first 100 games. But overall, yeah, this champion's in a rough spot. He's very much balanced around his OTPs, kind of akin to Katarina, but even more aggressively. Rammus not doing as well, with ADCs kind of fading out of just average play. Same goes for Malphite, in fact. Both these champions definitely suffering from the ADCs fizzling out and AD champions being a bit less popular, albeit still pretty popular in the top lane. A lot of the main picks in the top lane, obviously, like your Garens, your Dariuses, your Sets, your Nassuses, which Rammus can operate into if he does like the proxy back into Bramble Vest and then the alternate between W and Emax. But overall, this champion just tends to be a bit of a downgrade to Malphite, doesn't have anywhere near the same level of lane presence, and is a bit more reliant on the enemy messing up and like autoing you whilst your W is up, and not really understanding how your champion functions. Overall, Rammus sits towards the low end of my C tier. Olaf. So Olaf has seen competitive play now, which is good to see. I think this champion definitely has strengths in matchups where you're playing him to like tanks and you can really utilize the full value of this guy's kit. Obviously, with the ultimate, it can disable a lot of champions' core abilities, whether that's like Brittle on Ornn, whether that's like Urgot's, 3 of Urgot's abilities, making that matchup obviously very hard for Urgot. But this pick definitely got nerfed pretty heavily. It also had Ghost nerfed, and in general, he's definitely not performing anywhere near as well as he has done in previous seasons. He's still a pretty niche C tier pick, but I definitely think if you find him in the right spots and you're playing him like in those correct angles, you can definitely get value out of this champion. But if you ever fall behind, it can be really hard to get value out of this pick, as he is very reliant on snowballing and then utilizing that snowball to close out games. Obviously, if you pair him with like certain combinations, whether that's Enchanter or Engage Support, you can kind of manipulate how this champion plays out, and like you could utilize him as like a full-blown like continuous attacker with like Enchanters, which can be really valuable for specific comps. But generalistically, he's definitely underperforming compared to where he has been previously. Udyr. So Udyr is another champion in my C tier. He's definitely been punished through the itemization being nowhere near as good as him, good for him as it has done in previous seasons. Ghost being nerfed also hurt him quite heavily in the top lane. In general, the main problem with Udyr is that Fated Ashes, which really benefits him in the jungle for his clear speed, just doesn't have that same effect in the top lane. So Lianju Rush is nowhere near as effective, and the Frozen Heart tends to be his second item in the top lane, whereas Deadman tends to be his second item in the jungle. Frozen Heart has been quite aggressively nerfed at this point, which also quite heavily hurts Udyr top, and in general he's just kind of dropped down to the C tier, but you can definitely make this champion function kind of akin to Olaf in a way. Both these picks kind of sit towards the high end of my C tier. Gnar drops towards the low end of my C tier. I've got to grab a drink. In Gnar's case, it's primarily because Fleet got nerfed, which definitely hurt him this patch. He was one of the core users of Fleet in the top lane, so he's been indirectly nerfed by that. He is being buffed in 14.18. I believe he is gaining 3 base AD, which is a nice change for Gnar. So if you want to put games into him now and then like work up towards the next patch, that's definitely something you could do. I wouldn't really recommend playing him in solo queue though. He tends to be a bit more matchup dependent, and yeah, unless you put the games in, you can definitely be punished for playing this pick as he's quite squishy. And yeah, if you fall behind, it can definitely be situations where you can be dove or just outright one-tapped within laning phase. Other champions dropping down, I actually don't have any more. Never mind. Moving on to the beta event. So we have Trundle. Trundle, still a very easy to pilot pick. Like a worse Yorick low elo, I would say, but obviously he's one of the easiest champions to pilot in the game. His playstyle is very stat sticky. If his numbers are too high, he's broken. If his numbers are too low, he's pretty mediocre, bad, and high elo especially, because his numbers are pretty weak at the moment, and he oftentimes can struggle if he ever falls behind. He tends to sim a beta, but his ease of play is what gives him this edge over some of the other champions. Like, you can put like 2-3 games to this pick and then like have full knowledge of how to play this champion for the most part, other than like maybe some niche mechanics with like pillar wall angles, which can obviously be the difference between some of these higher elo Trundle players, but there isn't a huge amount of them obviously. So yeah, this champion sits towards the low end of the B tier at the moment. Briar is here because I know some people like seeing Briar on the tier list, and I think this champion does have a space within the top lane. She's kind of like I would say she's more akin to Warwick in a way, where she's quite aggressive in how she can operate and quite deceptive in where a lot of her power lies. But if you're not able to find those snowball angles, she can definitely feel quite lackluster. If the enemy has knowledge of your champion, it really hurts your ability to have a snowball and find traction within the game, which is where I think a lot of the difference between Warwick and Briar lies. Warwick, I'd argue, is a bit better in most spaces, tends to be a bit better in higher elos as well, whereas Briar, you could argue, kind of falls off going into Diamond and then like very aggressively into those higher elos. Warwick doesn't have that quite that same fall off, but does get a bit weaker obviously when people like respect the kit a lot more, the sustain, the like last stand capabilities of these two champions. I'd just say Briar is a little bit weaker, but she's definitely functional in the top lane, and if you enjoy playing Briar, you could definitely play her in this role. Silas was going to move up to my A tier, but stays within my B tier. The nerfs this patch did hurt him a bit. Obviously, 10% AP ratio of one of your core abilities can hurt quite a bit. It's looking to be that both AP, like full AP, the Lichbane, Shadow Flame, Rabadon variant, and the Roa, Protobelt, or Cosmic variant tend to be pretty neutral with each other. Both can operate quite well and just function within like multiple like in different games. Obviously, Silas top primarily is just utilized as a counter pick in the Malphite. You don't really see him a huge amount outside of that, but the changes have definitely opened him up to be played in more matchups. So if you want to play with Silas top, go ahead. You still want to play him primarily in the matchups where he's going to benefit from their ultimate, but it's nowhere near as troll as it has been in, like previously. The changes have definitely helped him, especially if you want to opt into some of those Bruiser variants. Jax. So Jax is going to get buffed in 40.18 as well. Right now, he is definitely struggling a bit more. There aren't as many range matchups in the top lane, which he was really benefiting from. He benefited from like your Twisted Fates, your Veins, stuff like this, where Counter-Strike had insane amounts of value. He obviously did get nerfed more recently. The E lost a second cooldown, which does hurt this champion. It is his core ability, his ability to mitigate damage and then output a level of damage. It's his most unfair ability as well. Yeah, losing some power off that definitely does hurt him. He now sits towards the middle of my B tier, but you can still definitely make him function in a lot of matchups. But there are matchups which he would definitely have less value in, where you're not going to get like the value out of the Counter-Strike. Quinn, also with my beta, she's like a high beta option. It's just mid-Quinn, but slightly worse at the moment. It's the Electrocute, Profane Hydra. I know Kerboss is promoting Stridebreaker as being like an option in the top lane, but it's definitely worth experimenting. There might be some like angles and power there. Overall, I'd recommend playing Quinn mid if you do enjoy playing Quinn. If you want to play Quinn top, she's a bit more matchup dependent. You're not going to get the same level of roam capabilities, but there's definitely power to this pick. She kind of sits towards the high end of my B tier. Darius, going to also be with my B tier. He's a bit more elite skewed than a lot of people give him credit for. Obviously, being an early game skewed champion does kind of attribute to that. On top of this, he obviously is a bit weaker with Ghost being nerfed, and that's definitely hurt him a lot going into the split. He now sits as like this low, like a mid B tier option. If you're able to get those advantages and then snowball, close out a game, he can be really valuable. He can be like a close to S tier pick. If you're not able to get these angles, he really does fall off quite aggressively until like very late, which he can sometimes come back into if you're able to get that like chain R scenarios. There is definitely power there, but for the most part, he's a bit early game skewed. You have to utilize that power to close out games. If you don't, the champion would definitely struggle in those mid game fights if you're not ahead of the curve quite aggressively. He's like a mid B tier pick, but you can definitely make him work, especially if you're very confident in utilizing the power of an early game champion. Aurora and Sion are my other two champions which are going to stay within the beta. In Sion's case, he's a bit too fair at the moment. If you're not able to consistently land full charge Qs, this pick really does lose quite a bit of power. Obviously, you tend to synergize Q with E, making use of the slow to get that full charge Q. But the pick is a bit more, it can't really go any higher at the moment because it's a bit too telegraphed. It doesn't have the level of durability or damage to really swing either way. He's a bit of both at the moment, and there's definitely value to that. This champion can obviously tank a decent amount. The passive can be quite valuable. The damage can be valuable, especially if you're like opting into it quite aggressively, whether that's like Steric, Titanic Hydra, Overlord's Bloodmail. There's one other item which I've completely forgotten, but you can opt into on Sion and definitely make it function. Like all of these items definitely can give this champion a bit more damage and can be quite good in certain scenarios. If you're not confident in doing damage over this champion, then you can just go full-blown tank, your Heartsteals, your Sunfires, your Thornmails, your Kanek Rookens, and there's definitely value to those builds as well, especially if, like, depending on the matchup, there's definitely more value there. Overall, this champion can't really go much higher at the moment, but like sits as like a solid high B option. If you put the games in, you can definitely feel quite good on this champion, but it doesn't have anywhere near as much agency as some of the other carries within the top lane. In Aurora's case, she got nerfed this patch. She was going to jump up to the A tier. The nerfs kind of keep her within the B tier. It's a lot of power to lose on your ultimate when that is one of your big like AoE abilities. Overall, she still has really valuable kiting. The ultimate is still a really good ability, so that can definitely still be something you play into. But she has just lost a bit of power. I don't expect her to stay within the B tier. I think if people continue to learn this champion, she will definitely rise back up to the A tier at some point. But for the moment, she does sit within the B tier. If you put the games in though, you can still be rewarded for playing a champion like this. Moving down from the A tier, then we have Malphite. So Malphite, I've been kind of off Malphite for a while. I think this champion was to a degree overrated, like on my tier list. I think I had him a bit too high, mainly because he's really easy to play, and like you can have like no resources for the most part on this pick and still have like lots of value. Obviously I'm being hyperbolic to a degree, but this champion really does not need enough to not need a lot, and doesn't really need kills to have access to most of the value this champion's going to have within the game, that being like the ultimate, the Q slow, and just relative durability. Obviously that is what primarily is his gold scaler. Overall, he's not doing as well anymore. There's lots of matchups which, like unless you're picking this champion R5, there are lots of champions which can just outright nullify Malphite or just really heavily win into him. That being like Ornn, Silas, stuff like that. AP matchups primarily, which like really dominate Malphite, especially if you do end up in those counterpick scenarios. Overall, I think he drops down to the B tier, even though he still is very easy to play and very low econ. You can operate him obviously in 4-5 AD pick games, and you can still pick him out, especially if like enemy topper's already been shown and you can find those angles, but he's just not quite an A tier pick anymore. Other champions dropping down, we have Kayle, we have Pantheon, we have Gragas, who sits now towards the high end of my B tier. Kennen got nerfed, he now drops down to my B tier as well, and I think I had one more. No, that looks to be it. So yeah, in Kayle's case, Fleet got nerfed, she loses a bit of power, she drops from the A tier to the B tier. It hurts her scaling, it hurts her ability to play as well in lane, and obviously Nasus's popularity will also hurt Kayle. Nasus is very strong into Kayle, that Wither has so much value into this pick. Kennen's case, obviously that 10% AP ratio loss on Q hurts him a bit, drops him from like a low A to a B tier pick. Obviously he tends to be pretty elite skewed, being a ranged harass early game based top laner does kind of attribute to that. Pantheon just hasn't really found the success I was hoping he would with the changes. It looks to be pretty neutral between like Eclipse and Cleaver as like a first item rush. Obviously, you do have access to things like Shojin, Sterix, Overlord's Bloodmail, which could all be really valuable items on him. But he just isn't finding that level of success I was hoping for. In Gragas' case, he's been a bit on a downhill trend for a while now. He did get nerfed back along, like the passive got quite aggressively nerfed. Overall, it's just left him in a spot where I'd say he's still like an A tier, maybe even like close to S tier pick with an elite, where they have like a really strong understanding of a champion, utilize its full kit, like use him primarily as like a lane holder or like a lane neutralizer, and even with a level of kill threat, just don't find those angles as much within mid elo. So yeah, I'm gonna drop him down from the A tier to the B tier. Moving on to the A tier then, so we have Aurelia. Actually, no, Aurelia I was going to drop down. That was the other champion. So Aurelia drops down from my A tier into my B tier. The block changes last patch were enough to like cement her spot in the B tier, combined with some of the other changes over the last couple of patches just directly to Aurelia. She's a bit worse in low elo now, bit better in high elo, but yeah, the block changes were just neutral, powered down, so she drops down into the B tier. Yeah, moving on to the A tier then. So we have Gwen and Fiora. Both these picks, still great answers to tanks. If you're able to get ahead, they can be very oppressive in games. I'd argue that Gwen is slightly better than Fiora at the moment. I think Fiora has, like, if you mess up on Fiora, you're more likely to get punished. Like, your parry is, like, a lot of your power budget. If you can parry on Brittle, then that can be an incredibly heavily favoured trade. If you mess it up, you can oftentimes find yourself just having to back and then like go back to lane and try again, which can be very punishing. In Gwen's case, she has a bit more room for error, spikes a bit more aggressively later on into the game. But yeah, both these picks primarily like utilize as counter picks. You can't really pick them blind, but they are very, very oppressive in those spots, which is why they deserve like low A tier spots. I'd argue that's probably why. Obviously, they're pretty high skill, and if you want to argue they should be B tier picks, I can agree with that as well. I think that's perfectly reasonable. And the theory is like a hidden OP AD assassin top laner. She kind of is the only one in that space at the moment. I guess Kled is maybe, you could argue, the other one here, where you build like Profane Hydra and then you're playing very much as like a heavy dive option. The theory is a lot easier to play than Kled. Arguably a bit better because the scaling is a bit more aggressive. Kled a bit more early game skewed, but if you find those angles, obviously Kled can snowball very aggressively. But yeah, Neferi, very underrated pick in the top lane at the moment. A great AD assassin stat stick, which scales very well. I think the champion slept on. But yeah. So moving up from the B tier, we have Vladimir and Ryze. Both these picks are doing a bit better now. In Vladimir's case, he just generically moves up to the A tier. Some of the other champions dropping down to the B tier gives him space to move up. In Ryze's case, he got buffed this patch, and he really benefited from that. That allows him to, Q damage is a really big thing. Obviously, it's his core ability. R cooldown doesn't do a huge amount for average elo, but is a nice arguably quality of life placebo change, which can definitely help him be a bit more mobile around the map, and arguably move minions around into like spots which can like help you siege towers, help you end games. There is definitely a benefit to a change like that. Other champions moving up, so I'm going to move Aatrox and I'm going to move Cassiopeia back up. Cassiopeia, I originally moved down because she gained a lot of players and they were kind of deflating her win rate. Now that some of those people have hopped off, this champion's still a great top laner. I don't think she's anywhere near as good as she was previously. I think those changes were just strict nerfs in the end, but now that she's gone back to her primary audience, she jumps back up from the B tier to the A tier, and she can still be a great answer where you can get a lot of value out of her W, out of her kiting capability, out of her ultimate. In Aatrox's case, I think I had him slightly underrated. Obviously, there was a lot of discussion about that, I believe, in my last comment section, or the one before that, I can't correctly remember, but it was like the comparison between Renekton and Aatrox. I believe Aatrox is still a pretty, like, a more, arguably more elite skewed champion at the moment. He's a bit more feast or famine. Renekton, I'd say, is a bit more generically strong, and I'd argue a bit more easier in his current state. He also doesn't fall off anywhere near as aggressively as he has done in the past. He's still a very good mid-game champion now, whereas in the past, he obviously was very much just built around his early game strength and impressiveness. I still think both these picks are great within, like, games where they could snowball. In Aatrox's case, he's a bit more polarizing in terms of his matchups. In Renekton's case, I'd argue he can be blinded in a lot more situations, and is, in my opinion, a better just generic AD top laner, but Aatrox still probably deserves to be sat next to him to a degree, just a bit better in Elite. Well, I'd say he's close to the S tier, honestly. Moving on from these two picks, so we have Wukong and Tryndamere. Tryndamere will now look to just go directly to Grasp with the fleet nerfs. Obviously, it's very hard to move this champion out of lane with Ravenous Hydra and the level of sustain he has with like D-Shield and Second Wind. Wukong actually gaining traction at the moment. The buffs to him last patch really like helped his play rate more than anything, even though they were to a degree relatively placebo. Not placebo in the jungle, like they actually really helped in the jungle. They still helped quite aggressively in top lane AD matchups, but not to a large enough degree to like support his new amount of player base. I do believe some of that's obviously come from like people popularizing lethality, like hybrid lethality Wukong and hybrid tank Wukong, which we've seen some like variations of, whether that's like your Profane Hydras, your Sunfires. There seems to be some builds going around. Honestly, like if you want to put some games into Wukong, see what you like, see what works within the game, and then use that and like see if you can gain out of that. If not, you don't really need to play Wukong. He's not like a new meta defining mid-low elo pick, but he's definitely got more of a place than he has done in the past. Camille, still a very good elite skew pick. She's like S plus or like borderline S plus in elite for like solo cube. She's one of the best snowball side laning champions. Her isolated 1v1 is some of the best in the game. Obviously, her weakness does come from her team fighting. A lack of coordination can definitely hurt this champion. Overall, if you can But if you play her precisely, if you play around her strengths, she is a very good pick. Definitely something I'd recommend for solo queue. If you're not having success with Camille, I'd recommend other champions, or putting more games to the pick and really learning where her strengths lie and how to utilize her isolated power and her core strengths. Overall, she sits as like a mid A tier pick, low A tier pick for average play. For high elo, I'd argue borderline S plus tier. Shen, also with my A tier. This champion's kind of slept on at the moment. Maybe not like hugely. I know some people who actually genuinely think Shen is a great champion in his current state, but then I know a lot of people who kind of shrug at the idea of this champion being played, knowing that like obviously you give up a level of individual carry agency. You're a bit more reliant on like ADC, jungle, mid performing really well to get really strong amounts of value out of your ultimate. On top of this, if you find yourself losing lane quite consistently in this pick, it can definitely feel quite hard to like ever stop sieges against your tower. And like if you ever ult to a side lane, which isn't obviously your tower, then you can get heavily sieged against, especially if they're running Demolish, running Sheen, running like just having a champion which is like primarily just a good sieger. That can definitely feel quite punishing to players as this champion. But I do believe Shen is at a pretty good spot at the moment, so I'm going to have him within my A tier. In Singe's case, I'm actually going to put him towards the mid of the A tier. I think he's like a mid-low A tier option. The problem with Singe is obviously his playstyle is very unique. You have to play around proxying. The way you like play around enemy laner is very different compared to like almost all the rest of the top lane pool. His playstyle is very different, primarily utilizing his Q to like output damage rather than like auto attacks or like arguably more traditional abilities. Overall, this pick, if you put the games in, can definitely be really rewarding. I believe Singe is a very good champion if you if you understand where his power lies. You're utilizing his CC, his W effectively. Stuff like that can all be really valuable. And yeah, I think this champ's in a pretty good spot. He's very deserving of an A tier spot. Alawi actually sits towards the high end of my A tier. Alawi is very close to an S tier pick. With some of the champions which have really risen up in popularity, Alawi's really benefiting from that. Not quite an S tier pick though. She's a bit too... some champions do counter her a bit too hard, things like your Mordekaisers, and if you're not able to consistently land your E, it could definitely feel quite punishing to play this champion, but she's definitely rising up, and I feel like a lot more people are noticing that, and her play rate has definitely gone up. She's a very solid A tier pick in my opinion. Other than Alawi, we have Heimerdinger, who is a very slept-on champion. This pick is really benefiting from the itemization at the moment. Teemo, also really benefiting from itemization. He's, of course, a bit more matchup dependent and very reliant on his shrooms later on into the game. Like, if you're playing on your shroom builds, he is a very aggressive scaler. If you're playing more around lane, like you're going Fleet, Grasp, Airy, I guess, could be like one of the other keystone options. In fact, Teemo just has access to a lot of keystone options. Then you can very much play on lane. Things like Nash's can be quite a nice item on him. But you also have like Malignance, Liandry variants, which are very shroom dependent and could be very strong in those situations. Overall, Teemo, I think, is a really solid A tier pick at the moment. Kled and Warwick are a bit more gimmicky, but both these champions still very strong in like the correct spots. Kled tends to be very dependent on like finding those dive angles, utilizing Skull and dropping turret aggro to like look for kill angles. Warwick is more about sustain and being able to just be kind of deceptive in like where a lot of his power lies. Like you can very comfortably go down to like 100, 200 HP's Warwick and then turn the fight in your favor because of how this champion's kit functions, especially if you're running like Ignite Barrier or Flash Barrier, for example. This pick is definitely in a really good spot at the moment, especially with some of the itemization as well. You can opt into things like Stridebreaker, Titanic Hydra, Bork. There's lots of really valuable items for him. On top of this, we have Ornn and Cho'Gath, which I believe both to be really good at the moment as well. In Cho'Gath's case, he's really benefiting from the stat stick buffs he received. Buffing his E, buffing his Q flat damage have been really big for him. Definitely helped him a lot, especially with some of his build options. 1 second. Especially with some of his build options. I've seen the popular build of Trinity Force second. Once again, Carbos has popularized this for the most part. You can go Heartsteel Trinity or Warmog's Trinity, but with the Warmog's nerf, I would recommend going primarily Heartsteel. That is like a really strong 2-item core, especially if you're looking to access a bit more damage. Obviously, you can still go standard tank and you can go some tank AP hybrid variations. However, those can be a bit less reliable. Overall, Cho'Gath definitely doing better at the moment as like a solid A-tier pick. Ornn has slowly been rising back up. A lot of the problems almost facing with some of the ranged matchups, as he doesn't have great tools to do with that, outside of like Summonary, 3 points Q, and oftentimes not even points Q at the moment. I've seen a lot of people just going Summonary W max. There's definitely different build variations there, but Ornn, benefiting from that, definitely solidifies himself more as a high A tier option now. Other champions which have dropped down to the A tier from the S tier are Poppy and Mundo, if I can find him. So Mundo lost a lot of power this patch. Warlocks being nerfed was a very big hit towards him. You should now be looking at Heartsteel Rush almost every game again. You can go Warlord second, but you now have access to other good items, especially in that second slot, and then third, fourth slot onwards. In Poppy's case, she's a bit more matchup dependent. She's still a very good pick. Like, she's still like one of the closer to S tier picks. I just don't believe she's as solidified in the S tier as some of the other options, which is why I'm dropping her down. But she's still a very good pick, especially if you can choose for correct games to go like Sun and Sky variations and more tanky variations, whether that's like Winter's Approach, stuff like that. My S tier. So, let's start from the back. I'm going to have, actually, I'll have Volibear right at the back here. Volibear is the closest champion moving down to the A tier. His builds are very volatile. Obviously, if you find yourself snowballing, this champion could be incredibly aggressive. This would be like D-Blade or Doran's Ring start into Roa or Riftmaker, and then Flicker Blades into like Frozen Heart, Spirit's Visage. Stuff like that can all be really nice on him. Nash's Tooth, also a great option. What's the other one? Ginsu's Rage Blade, I have seen some people opted to. There's loads of build variations on Volibear at the moment, and he could definitely find a very good, comfortable spot to snowball and utilize Jack of Trades and be really valuable within the game. Zac, much more unpopular at the moment, but still a very strong pick in his current state. This is because of his damage, his mid-game versatility. His team fighting is incredibly valuable. He doesn't scale quite as well as some of the other options here, but he's still very good in those spots where he's able to kind of just neutralize lane and then be a really valuable mid-game AP tag option. In Tarketch's case, it's primarily because a lot of people haven't gone the correct build yet, the Heartsteel, Riftmaker, Protobelt, Rabadon variation, which is in an incredible spot at the moment. Like, people should really be trying this a lot more. It is very powerful. Don't sleep on it. Very deserving of an S tier spot. The tank build arguably drops him down to like an A tier pick, but because of how good the AP build is, should be an S tier champion. Other than that, we have, which one do I want to put now? I'll put Mordekaiser. Mordekaiser can have some quite bad matchups, which is why I think he deserves to be a bit lower down in the S tier. However, he's still very competitive with the other S tier options, especially the likes of Urgot, which also has some pretty bad matchups, but really benefited from the cleaver changes combined with ranged champions being continuously nerfed. Really benefited from that as well. In the case of Yorick, he's very easy to play, very low elo skewed. Set and Garen are still great AD fighters of the top lane. Set tends to be a bit more Juggernaut based. Garen can opt into a bit more crit strike and some of his crit damage builds, which can be really powerful and do a huge amount of damage. Oftentimes Garen can just outright stop lanes with like a 3-item core of Stridemaker, Phantom Dance, and Deadbands. Can be really valuable on him. And Nasus is like the pick of the patch. With how much like presence he now has within competitive, it's really like kind of out the bag at this point, but Nasus is a great champion, especially if you're speccing into like 3-4 points E and then opting into like a Q max or like there's loads of different variations you can play this champion actually, but I'd recommend 3-4 points E or Q max builds and then go from there. Be really powerful within the game. He spikes primarily on 2 items, especially within the mid game. He doesn't scale anywhere near as well as a lot of people think he does. Even though technically he is a late game scaler, it's kind of deceptive in a way, especially with like his infinite stacking and stuff like that. But he's still a really valuable pick at the moment. Very deserving on an S tier spot. I'm losing my voice. Thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.